So the jazz music is playing, so that can only mean one thing, that it's time for another episode of That Racing History Podcast, brought to you as always by me, Aidan Millward. And I hope you're having a great day. You know, the weather has taken a turn for the worse here the last couple of days. It was 22 degrees a few days ago and now it's snowing. How does that work? Where else but England? But anyway, today I've got the story of when Sunday afternoons would have millions of people glued to BBC Grandstand and a period of uncensored, unadulterated crashing, when BTCC ruled the world. Yep, today it's the story of the British touring car's Super Touring era. The BTCC is Britain's touring car championship, and it has been since 1958, and back then it was called the British Saloon Car Championship. And the man who created the series was a bloke called Ken Gregory, who is probably better known as being the manager of Sir Stirling Moss. And Gregory convinced the British Racing and Sports Car Club that it should fill a gap left in the racing calendar with a series for production cars, because in the post-war years, nothing of that sort existed. So these modified production cars would race against Formula 3 and sports cars as support races, but they quickly became the main event. The first season was in 1958, and it saw Jack Sears and Tommy Sopwith tied on points, but both drivers were in different classes. So they settled the duel by getting two identical cars, and the two drivers went out and drove as hard as possible for 5 laps over 2 races. 5 laps in one car, and then another 5 laps in the other car to, accommodate for differences between the two. And by the end, Sopwith had won by 2.2 seconds once the organisers had added up the cumulative lap times. But in the second race, Sears had won by 3.8 seconds. So as both drivers had won one race each, Sears was declared champion because he'd won by the biggest margin. This all despite the fact that Sopwith was in the senior class, and he'd won more races this season and set more fastest laps. You'd think then they would have changed the rules. But no. Identical points were handed out to class winners, so if we were to take some names from the current BTCC grid and pretend they're all in different classes, I can try and at least spell it out for you. So imagine Colin Turkington, Sam Tordoff, Tom Chilton and Andrew Jordan finished the race 1st to 4th in that order. Turkington gets 20 points, Tordoff 17, Chilton 15 and Jordan 13. But Ash Sutton in a lower class finishes 8th overall, but he won his class, so he gets 20 points. Follow that? It's fine if you don't, because I don't expect everybody to get it. So by the end of race 1, Turkington and Sutton are tied on points despite Turkington winning and Sutton coming 8th, but Sutton got 20 points for winning his class. How do you get winners' points by coming 8th? Just BTCC things. Now, they could have just done 2 separate championships, but no, it was overall. So you could have a lower class car winning the overall championship, and that did happen on occasion. But for some unknown reason, this system was in place for 32 years. So by the late 1980s, there were too many classes and nobody could figure out the point system. To get an idea as to how stupid it got, Andy Rouse won 9 of the 13 rounds of the season, but he only finished 3rd. Frank Sittner, founder of the Sittner BMW dealer group, which is now owned by Roger Penske, won the series despite his highest finish being 4th, and Phil Dowsett in 2nd could only finish as high as 10th. But as Sittner got 20 points for winning his class by finishing 4th, he technically won more races and then won the championship overall. Now imagine this, with 4 or 5 classes running simultaneously, with gratuitous crashing. So the BTCC needed a reset button. They ditched all of the class structures and reeled in the turbos to lessen the destruction when a crash happened. The Ford Sierra Cosworth RS 500s were pissing on the rest of the field despite Sittner winning the championship in his Class B BMW. But due to the class system, cars such as the Ford Falcon, Holden Commodore, Opel Monza, Mazda RX-7 and other foreign cars were able to drop into the series due to the FIA homologation at the time. But the point system was still confusing. In the final year of the multi-class system, the Sierra and BMW ruled their classes. John I'm Going for First Says Cleland won the overall series in his factory-prepared Vauxhall Astra GTE. They then introduced 2 new classes for 1990. One championship for cars up to 2 litre displacement, and one for cars over 2 litres displacement. The proposed formula was accepted by the FIA and later became the standard for touring cars all over the world. The Sierra Cosworths continued to dominate, and then in 1991 the above 2 litre displacement category was dropped. And no, I'm not going to say it. Fine. Cosworth. The overall formula of what constituted a touring car was largely left unchanged. The cars were required to be a minimum of 4.2 metres long with 4 doors and be classed as a family car by Euro NCAP. No more than 6 cylinders or 2 litre displacement allowed, and they were essentially your average family cars stripped of excess weight, a body kit attached, and even with all that, still looked like what your dad would have bought from the dealer and driven you to school with on the Monday morning. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. The new 2-litre formula attracted a lot of interest, as BMW, Ford, Alfa Romeo, Vauxhall, Nissan and Toyota all entered factory-backed cars. And there was no runaway winner, with the top 4 drivers in the championship, Will Hoy in the M3, I'm going for first says Cleland in the Vauxhall Cavalier, Andy Rouse in the Toyota Carina, and Steve Soper's BMW M3, all winning 3 races. Tim Harvey won the final round, but 5th meant Hoy clinched the title. Then in 1992 the management changed hands. Toka took over and set out attracting manufacturers and setting up a support race package for the race weekends. The interest in aerodynamic arms race between the manufacturers as well as the close racing enabled driver rivalries to blossom. At Brands Hatch, Will Hoy and Rouse had a tangle that sent them into the barriers. Tim Harvey couldn't get a win until mid-season, and then he won 4 in a row to make sure that the final race of the 1992 season went to a 3-way fight at Silverstone. Hoy, Cleland and Harvey. Rouse won the race, but the race itself was explosive. This being October, it rained during qualifying, and Cleland, Hoy and Harvey were in the middle of the pack, while Jeff Allen, David Leslie and Andy Rouse were at the top end. And on the first lap, Soper was punted by Leslie and then hit by Rob Gravitt. Soper's rear end was caved in, but he still got back on track and started to carve his BMW through the field. And while Cleland was fighting for 4th with Harvey, Soper caught them and barged his way through at Stowe, causing Cleland to signal to Soper that he was going for first. Now, funnily enough, both pieces of iconic touring car commentary involve John Cleland. The first is that moment where he said he was going for first, as described by the late Murray Walker, and on that occasion Cleland flipped Soper the bird if you haven't seen it. And the second was a WTCC race at Oschersleben in Germany, where Cleland was on commentary and said, "The man who designed that corner needs to be taken into a dark room and beaten." Harvey then muscled past Cleland before Soper let him through, but then at Brooklands, Cleland tried to have a crack at Soper by two-wheeling his Vauxhall through the corner. And Soper, meanwhile, wasn't going to let Cleland take the title from his teammate, so he drove straight across the grass like he was in an Assetto Corsa open lobby and punted Cleland straight in the driver's door and off the track. As you can imagine, Cleland was absolutely fuming after being wiped out like that, and he said to the BBC, "He chopped me a few times and then sent me into the barriers. I mean, what are we doing here? He might get away with that in Germany where he's Mr. Superstar, but here this series is clean. The man's an animal." Yeah, clean racing in this era of touring cars? Yeah, come off it, John. Both teams filed complaints and both drivers were found to be guilty, although I can't really see what BMW had to complain about. Needless to say, the race result was not changed and Harvey kept the championship. In 1993, Ford returned and Renault also joined the sport. Joe Winkelhock won the title for BMW, with another international driver in Kiwi Paul Radicic joining the series. Winkelhock's win meant he became the first non-British driver in 20 years to win the title, and the series was evolving in terms of popularity and technology, with Volvo deciding to enter an estate car with the Tom Walkinshaw prepared 850, and Alfa caused a kerfuffle through the 1994 season with a controversial aerodynamic device. The rules up until 1995 stated that any aerodynamic parts must be part of the road-going car. So if the road-going Mondeo had a spoiler, the BTCC car could have one. If it didn't, the race car couldn't. Simple, really. But Alfa decided to be clever. They decided they were going to ship all the road-going 155TS cars with a spoiler and splitter retracted into the car. The owners could then undo a couple of screws, slide the splitter forward, and retighten those screws to give yourself a touring car on your driveway. This, of course, being before the inevitable electrical fires. It being sat on your driveway is probably the fastest that car ever went. Now, Alfa also spent a monstrous amount of money on building 2,500 of these cars to meet the minimum build requirements, and they sold the lot of them, to be fair to them. The spoiler would be pushed up from inside the boot, and off it went. It was cosmetic on the road car, but for the race car, it was a specifically designed spoiler to give a huge advantage aerodynamically, and Tarquini won the title by some margin. Tarquini was also involved in a big roll at Knockhill, which resulted in another iconic Murray Walker moment of, "Oh, off! That's Tarquini! How did that happen?" Well, I think he stacked it, Murray. Well, what actually happened is that Tim Harvey gave him what's colloquially known as a punt. He'd gone full send into a gap that barely existed and sent Tarquini rolling so many times that Fred Durst and Wes Borland wrote a song about it. Then at Alton Park, Alfa was told by Toka they had to retract these aerodynamic devices because Ford and Nissan had protested. The Ford team had even bought a road legal 155 to show Toka what they thought was wrong with it, so the FIA and Toka went to Alfa to explain to them what to do. Toka said, "Alright lads, very funny, but we need you to retract these wings." And Alfa said, "Why? We've done nothing wrong." So Toka said, "Look, Ford and Nissan have complained and we need them retracted while we look into it." So Alfa said, "But if you go to any Alfa dealer, you can buy one of these cars with the same splitter and wing." And Toka said, "Yeah, but do you buy them with these retracted or not?" And Alfa said, "Does it matter? We've built 2,500 of these cars with the aero bolted on. It's bolted on. It's in the rules. It comes with the aero parts on the car." So Toka got bored and said, "Are you going to retract them for this race or not?" And Alfa said, "No." They then stomped off home, and there is an image of the Alfa team transports leaving Alton Park just as thousands of fans are heading in. Alfa also lost all the points they'd accumulated at Silverstone and Snetterton, and it put Ford in the lead of the championship. Long story short, Toka and the FIA had decided that the 31 rivets required to lock the wing and split it into the race position was many illegal. After Alton Park, Alfa submitted their appeal, and the FIA stated that from the 1st of July 1994, any car that was to compete in Touring Car Class 2, so Super Touring by any other name, must be dealer fresh. Because Alfa was selling the cars to customers with the aero in the boot and not up in the so-called race position, they deemed it not dealer fresh and then illegal. The car was still allowed to race given that it met all of the other requirements for the series, despite being a homologation special. So the BTCC did a deal with Alfa. They'd be allowed to run their aero trickery until the 1st of July 1994, and after that date, it had to be run retracted. But after the 1st of July 1994, other teams would be allowed to add spoilers and splitters to their cars. And BMW did just that, starting at Silverstone, and went on to win 5 of the next 6 races. But because Tarquini was never off the podium for the rest of the season, he strolled to the title. Then the organisers introduced new rules to stop any other manufacturers taking the mickey like that ever again. Homologation specials were effectively banned as the minimum build was now 25,000 cars as opposed to 2,500. And they also allowed aero packages that had incredibly strict rules behind them to prevent downforce and dirty air levels getting too high, as well as trying to keep the costs down. Yeah, about that. Honda brought a team to the series in 1995, while Renault's operation was handed over to Williams. Yes, the Formula 1 team Williams. And using Alfa money, Alfa signed Derek Warwick to join them, and while Renault won the manufacturer's title, it was Cleland that took the driver's honours. And then Audi had a crack in 1996, using an A4 Quattro to win the title. It was utterly dominant, purely because it was a Quattro, and that meant it was four-wheel drive that the rule makers immediately put a stop to, thereby making front-wheel drive mandatory until NGTC rules came in for 2011. Then in 1997, Renault finally got their driver's champion with Swiss driver Alain Menu. By 1998, Renault, Volvo, Honda, Audi, Nissan, Peugeot, Ford, Alfa and Vauxhall all had factory teams, although Alfa never started the season. It's said that at the first round at Thruxton, they'd been to see Alan Gow and complained about the rules for the season. So Gow, being a no-nonsense Australian, led the Alfa team principals to the gate and said, "There's the gate, now F off." But there was also the fact that European touring car season had been reshuffled, meaning Alfa couldn't commit to both the British and European seasons. Given the 1994 fiasco, it could have easily been both. But the BTCC was about to hit its peak in terms of competition, star power, TV ratings, and crowd numbers. And some of the names involved were touring car royalty. Names such as Alain Menu, Jason Plato, Tommy Rutstad, Rickard Rydell, Gianni Morbidelli, James Thompson, Peter Cox, John Bincliffe, Ivan Muller, David Leslie, Anthony Reid, Tiff Needell, Tim Harvey, Paul Radisich, Will Hoy, Craig Baird, Nigel Mansell, Nicola Larini, Fabrizio Giovanardi, Derek Warwick, John Cleland and Matt Neal. In 1998, Rydell took the championship in the Volvo S40, and what a cracking looking car it was too. And Nigel Mansell caused a storm when he did 3 guest appearances for Ford at Brands Hatch, Silverstone and Donington. And while most of the people at a rain-soaked Donington were there just to watch Nigel scratch his own arse, he kept up with many of the established names and put on one hell of a show. It went better than his Brands Hatch attempt, given that he got punted out in both races. The BTCC also introduced a new format where each event had a sprint race and a feature race. The feature races were 25% longer than the sprint races and required a 2-tyre stop, and viewers at the track and on television could identify who had pitted via a fluorescent strip by the driver's name on the rear passenger windows, and then that strip was torn off when the driver had pitted. The pit stops could only be performed between 15% and 75% race distance, and this added a strategy element to races, as well as the usual and at the time accepted door banging and punting and gratuitous crashing. The races were barely 20 minutes long, so it was get to the front as fast as possible, although there is more to the BTCC than just punting. In 1999, despite a disastrous start to the season, Frenchman Laurent Aiello took the title for Nissan, with that Primera from that season being one of my favourite racing cars of all time. It, like a lot of the other BTCC cars of that era, just looked so cool. And thanks to 2 successful BTCC video games by Codemasters, brilliant TV highlights on BBC Grandstand, and being shown live on Eurosport with commentary from Ben Edwards and John Watson, the BTCC had hit its peak. There was coverage in BBC Top Gear magazine, packed grandstands and star names, which all added up meant that for a few years in the 90s, the BTCC was king of production car racing. But all that glory came at a huge cost. Literally. 1999 was the beginning of the end. Costs had properly escalated as the teams were spending big to not only build the best cars, but sign the big-name drivers to drive them. Ford, Renault and Nissan reportedly spent £10 million on their 1998 season, equal to £17 million today, and the average salary was around £300,000. For 1999, Matt Neal, who was running as a privateer Nissan entry, approached the factory team and said he would drive for Nissan for free. This being the same Matt Neal who had run outright in a privateer Nissan at Donington and bagged himself a lot of money for the trouble. But instead of taking on a driver offering himself for free, and a driver that had proven himself in the series, Nissan signed Laurent Aiello instead, for £750,000. That's what most teams in the BTCC today spend on just the car. Also that year, which I was helpfully reminded on Twitter just today, Alan Menu almost ended up in the lake at Alton Park. There was still that mentalness going on in terms of the on-track action, but off-track, costs were getting even more insane. Not because they were spending $10 million on the car, but they were doing stupid things. Ford was spending $150,000 just to glue the wipers in a certain position for qualifying, which was apparently worth 0.2 a lap. Renault had trick suspension, trick spoilers, an early version of the mass damper that made its way onto Fernando Alonso's F1 cars. Stuff that cost thousands to run on what was essentially a souped-up road car. Something that you would see smaller versions of in the Halfords car park. And as the BTCC entered the 21st century, only Ford, Vauxhall and Honda remained as manufacturers, as most of the other manufacturers went to DTM, Endurance Racing or the World Touring Car Championship. There were 3 independent teams and the rest of the grid was made up of Class B cars that met FIA super production regulations, and then entries were accepted on a first-come, first-served basis. And I turned off watching it at this point. And following the death of Super Touring, the BTCC suffered massively. Alan Gow, the BTCC's Bernie Eccleston by any other name, decided to sell TOCA and take a bit of a break. And the new BTC spec cars designed to reduce costs attracted some entries, but the series still had to boost the grid with Group N production cars. Triple Eight Race Engineering, who now run the Red Bull Holden racing team in Australia, won 25 of the 26 races, with Jason Plato beating Ivan Muller to the title. Vauxhall's domination reduced viewing figures even further, and the BTCC was now a shadow of its former self. Gow returned in 2003 with a whole new rulebook, meaning cars complying with Super 2000 rules in the European Touring Car Championship could be used, and it meant teams and manufacturers could enter and fight with cars that didn't need changing. And it saved the series. In 2011, the sport introduced the NGTC, or Next Generation Touring Car, which is still in use today. And in 2019, the sport was probably at its healthiest since the 1998 season, although it has suffered a tiny bit of a setback thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2011, the BTCC saw its largest ever crowd, as 42,000 people attended at Brands Hatch. The NGTC is now the established format, but the DNA of the BTCC has largely remained the same. Whereas in the 1990s a Renault Laguna looked like a Renault Laguna, the Vauxhall Astra still looks like a Vauxhall Astra. Unlike in Germany, where they had to add DRS to the cars because they weren't touring cars anymore, and now German touring cars has become a GT3 series. Because Germany. For people my age, Super Touring was the best thing ever. I grew up watching them and it was how I got into this form of racing before discovering V8 supercars later on. You could relate to the BTCC easily. You picked your allegiances based on what car your dad had. The Mondeo hadn't got any of the parts of the road car, but you could tell it was still a Ford Mondeo. And we played the Toka games on the PlayStation to death and we loved watching the manufacturers go at it. And of course, we loved the crashing. It was proper win on Sunday and sell on Monday stuff. We talk about the V10s in Formula 1 and how we're blinded by the nostalgia of how great things were back then, but Super Touring truly was great. It was like WWF on four wheels. We had the big name manufacturers, we had the big name drivers, we had punting, panel bashing, smashes, and just full on, elbows out racing. And the NGTC regulations have made sure we've got most of that back, as well as now having front and rear wheel drive cars. And if this has been your first exposure to this era, I highly recommend going through YouTube and watching it. It's the BTCC's golden era. That time when BTCC ruled the world. And to carry on the analogy with wrestling, it was the BTCC's Attitude Era, with Jason Plato and Matt Neal being like the equivalent of the BTCC's Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. So now I've got the bug. I need to go and drive these things now in Assetto Corsa or R-Factor 2 and just experience that front-wheel drive power. So thank you very much for listening. This has been one of my favourites to research as it's brought back all of those memories and just remembering all of those different brands of car on the grid. And if you've enjoyed this look back on the BTCC's glory years, then show some love on the YouTube version of this video by liking the video, maybe even sharing the living daylights out of it to get people to watch. And if you are new, subscribe so you get notified of the next episode of this podcast. And if you found this podcast through Spotify's recommended stuff, then click follow if you haven't followed already. That Racing History Podcast is a Patreon-backed show, and if you wish to help support this podcast or just my YouTube channel in general at a more personal level, then you can do so by heading to the Patreon page at patreon.com/AidenMillward. That's AidenMillward. So Aiden with an A and not an E. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and all that good stuff. And there is also a Discord where you can join in the chat there. For YouTube listeners, all that stuff is handily in the description box for you. So until next time, I've been Aiden Millward with That Racing History Podcast. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.